So often, visits to Grandma and Grandpa's were also trips back to the old family farm. There were more roots there than in the cellar, and family ties were deeper than the well that brought forth sparkling water. Travel back in time with Vance Fazzino as he recalls one such visit to Grandfather's farm. How I loved the approach to Grandfather's farm. We turned off the main tarred road onto wagon tracks of packed earth, dry and dusty in the summer, wet and muddy in the winter, and always bumpy. On the right side, a small gully rose to where the farmhouse stood. This area was filled with several varieties of apple trees, so when driving on the road you were almost level with the treetops. All along the road were other fruit trees, pears, peaches, and cherries. In the spring it was a fantastic sight, pink and white blossoms everywhere like clouds kissing the earth. It was a cotton candy fantasy. Driving up the small hill to the house, the first thing we came upon was the magical barn. At least it seemed magical to me. A tall, simple structure of post and beam construction, it was sheathed in vertical boards that had been stained by nature in warm tones of beige, gold, and brown. Terracotta streaks ran from the rusting nails, adding to its character. The shake roof echoed the same colors, but it was light, bleached by the sun. As I opened the large doors to the barn, a soft, warm aroma greeted my nostrils, a combination of dried hay, molasses, and oats. To the right was a very steep staircase, so steep that you needed 2 hands to climb it to the loft. The steps and handrails were worn smooth from use, with a patina like waxed country furniture. How many times had my grandfather or my young uncle climbed those steps to send hay to the animals below? How often had my mother and her sisters taken refuge in the loft away from their overbearing stepmother? Each touch of hand and foot polished the steps a little more. What a great place it was for me just to lay on my back and dream. I watched spiders spin their webs in the dusty corners and stared back at the family of owls high in the rafters. I searched the roof for little shafts of light pouring in between the shakes, and then marveled that those shakes never allowed the rain to enter. When I was 10, the only occupant of the barn was Brutus, a dear old workhorse, gentle and patient, always ready to pull the plow or wagon or let my brothers and me ride on his swayed back. The cows had been sold. Grandfather was getting on in years, and they had become too great a chore for him. He still kept 3 goats in one of the smaller barns, though, for milk and cheese. In between the barn and the carriage house was Grandfather's pride, a gigantic cherry tree that he had planted the day he purchased the farm in 1886. The huge tree was 64 years old in 1950, and of course the sweetest fruit was on the highest branches. Grandfather allowed us kids to climb for the best cherries, much to my mother's dismay. She constantly warned us to be careful as she watched from below. In front of the house, Grandfather had planted an enormous bed of phlox. To this day I have not seen its equal. The basketball-sized flower heads attracted bees, wasps, and sphinx moths, all doing their best to satisfy their appetites for the sweet nectar. Grandfather had also planted lilacs and roses just for the beauty. The house was always a wonder to me. There was no electricity or indoor plumbing. We had it at home, but the remote farm was still out of the reach of power lines. The scent of kerosene was always present, since it was the only source of light after dark. The kitchen was on the lowest level, down 4 or 5 steps. The stone walls had been plastered and whitewashed. The floor was of smooth, waxed stones, with a few rag rugs scattered about. To the left stood a large old cast-iron stove that still burned wood and baked the best bread ever. At the back of the room, a staircase led to the upper floors, and to the right was the stone sink with the pump. A low door led to the root cellar, but it seemed more like a treasure room to a child of 10. Here the harvest of the summer lay ready for winter's hard days. Baskets of dried beans and potatoes, squash, pumpkins, and cabbages lay nestled in straw. Carrots were carefully stored in a barrel of clean, damp sand. Onions and garlic hung from the rafters along with herbs, which would be used for seasonings. Barrels of apples and pears stood ready for eating and baking. The room was lined with shelves containing hundreds of ball and mason jars. Today, Martha Stewart considers them collectible, clear and green tinted glass with a wire snap over the top. Back then, they were strictly utilitarian, filled with preserves of all types, tomatoes, green beans, corn, peppers, and beets. Cucumbers were made into pickles and relishes. Fruits for winter desserts were preserved as well, along with berries which were made into jams and jellies. As I looked around the root cellar, I remembered harvesting all those foods. My parents took us to the farm to help Grandfather gather the summer's bounty. My brothers and I helped my father and grandfather pick whatever was ready, while my mother and Nana preserved it in those glass jars. When the green beans were picked, we would all sit together at a large outdoor table, shelling beans and listening to Grandfather tell stories from his youth. Sometimes they brought the wind-up gramophone outside, and we listened to Grandfather's collection of Caruso recordings on large sepia-colored discs. It never seemed to be a chore when we worked together. There was always laughter or singing to make the work seem lighter, and love, that comfortable, indefinable kind of love that surrounds you and makes you a part of life, part of the family. Today, when it gets stressful, I think back to the idyllic time spent in the loving embrace of Grandfather's farm. Grandmother Sklodowski was a hard-working immigrant who made the most of her opportunities in the New World. Helene Voto remembers her grandmother's determination to make a better life for her family in my grandmother's kitchen.
My grandmother, Tekla Vanovitz Sklodowski, immigrated from Lithuania in 1909. During her childhood, Lithuania was part of Russia, and she remembered praying for Tsar Nicholas at Sunday morning services. She was 18 when she left her village, first traveling by cart and train to Bremen, Germany, and then by boat to Liverpool. After several days, she left for America with all her belongings tied up in a blanket. One change of clothes, her food, and a pot to cook in. She had $2 sewn into the hem of her long skirt. The wool dyed and woven by her mother from the sheep on their small farm. My grandmother spoke no English, and after a rough crossing landed at the port of Philadelphia. She soon found work in a textile mill, and after a few years of strikes, low wages, and terrible housing, married my grandfather, John Sklodowski, in 1912. Her husband became paralyzed during the influenza epidemic of 1918, and after hearing of work in a mill in New England, she moved her stricken husband and 2 small children to Somersville, Connecticut. They came by train, and in addition to their 2 suitcases and a trunk that was sent ahead, she brought her sewing machine and an enamel tub in which to bathe the children. She worked as a weaver and picker in the mill for 35 years, 5.5 days a week, 10 hours a day. Her husband died, and then her young son, born after their move to Connecticut. Her eldest son was lost during World War II, and so my mother was her only surviving child. My mother married in 1937, and I was born in 1940, 2 years after my brother Bill. We lived in the same mill housing that my grandmother had moved to in 1918, more than 30 years earlier. There was no heat, no hot water, and no indoor plumbing, but my grandmother made it a palace. She sewed our clothes from cotton grain bags and remnants from the mill. She rented a garden allotment, and we had vegetables all year long. In the winter, I would go down the wooden stairs to the dark cellar and bring up jars of stewed tomatoes, green beans, and carrots. My grandmother bartered for milk, cheese, a chicken, or some eggs in return for her vegetables or handmade dresses and coats. She sewed in the evenings, bent over the old Singer sewing machine, long after my brother and I were in bed. When we awoke in the morning, she had already left for work. In the summer, I would walk across the field in back of our house to the mill where she sat at a window across from the falls. If it was her half-hour lunch break, she would come outside, and we would sit on the warm granite steps and share her dark bread and cold potatoes. The water from the old soapstone sink was heated on a big black stove in the kitchen. As children, my brother and I bathed in the sink, and later in the enamel tub brought from Philadelphia. A vent was cut in the ceiling above the stove, and even though my brother and I wore hats, sweaters, and mittens to bed, the heat from the stove barely kept our room from frosting over. We could see our icy breath in the light from the window and snuggled closer to keep warm. The food she prepared had its own story to tell. She colored our Easter eggs with onion skins and vegetable dyes. During walks in the woods, she knew which mushrooms were poisonous and which were not. She gathered greens and berries from the woods, and from old coat hangers made festive Christmas wreaths to hang on both our doors. There was always a pot of soup simmering on the stove, bread baking in the oven, and old-world foods filling the kitchen with aromas of onions, sauerkraut, and spices. Except for sleeping, we lived in the kitchen, as it was the only heated room in the house. My grandmother was a warm, nurturing woman. If you were sick, you could sleep with her on her homemade feather bed. We moved from Summersville when I was 9 years old to a house built with the $15,000 my grandmother had managed to save during her 35 years of work in the mill. Our new home had heat, hot water, a bathroom, and even a telephone. What luxury! But by this time my grandmother was 60 and suffering from cancer. However, thanks to a prayer, a skilled surgeon, and her strength and resilience, she survived and lived for another 34 years. Her well-earned retirement years almost equaled the long, hard years spent in the mill. My grandmother lived a full life, full of history and experiences and courage. She was self-reliant, resourceful, and self-sufficient. Like many early immigrants, she was a survivor. She met and overcame life's adversities head-on, took disappointments in stride and challenges for what they were, and all the while never faltered or missed a beat. No problem or tragedy was too overwhelming, no loss or pain too great. She always emerged the victor. She was an incredible woman, and I miss her very much. My own children were teenagers when she passed away in 1984, so they too had the joy of knowing this remarkable woman. We have the story of her voyage to America on tape, and sometimes when I miss her, I put on the stereo and listen to her as she speaks to me from the past.
Grandma Hay was quite a lady. She had a mischievous turn to her that was sometimes just a bit unpredictable. Her grandson, David Hay, shared this memory of his grandmother with the readers of Good Old Days magazine over a quarter of a century ago, when he was just 26 years old. You'll get a chuckle out of David's memory of a fun-loving grandmother.
The good old days for many go back to the early days of the 1900s. But since I'm only 26 years of age, Those special childhood days of mine go back only to the 1950s. They were carefree days for me, filled with many interesting happenings. As the years pass, they become the favorite of all times with me. My memory often reverts back to those beautiful days in the summer when kids were free of all cares, including having to get up each day and sit in a classroom. We lived for our summer vacation, and our hearts were joyful when the last days of school finally arrived. We lived on a dairy farm and shared our large old farmhouse with a sentimental grandmother who thrilled us often with special stories of her childhood days in the 1880s. Her family was fun-loving. Those who knew Grandmother Hay recall hearing her tell some of the stories about her father and what he would do for fun. When Grandma was young and of courting age, Great-Grandpa was having his heyday. When she was on her date, she often came home to find tin cans tied on binder twine and tied to the gate. Naturally, when the gate opened, there would be lots of clanging, and the Nixie father would usually hear it and chuckle to himself. He slept in the bedroom over the gate side of the yard, so he generally heard the noise bombs he had planted and knew what time she was getting home. There were times, too, when the fun got a little bit out of hand. Take, for example, the date evening when Great-Grandpa smeared horse manure onto the latch of the gate. When Grandma's beau brought her home that evening, he felt something messy on his hands as he opened the gate to walk Grandma to the farmhouse. Upon lighting the coal oil lamp inside, he soon discovered exactly what he had put his hand into. Imagine his thoughts. I inherited some of this fun-loving from my grandmother's side of the family. Maybe that's why these stories seem so fresh in my memory. The farm where I grew up and where my father continues to reside is nestled in the rolling countryside of southwestern Pennsylvania, near the community of Berlin. The farm has been in the Hay family for over 100 years, and I was part of the third generation of the Hays to grow up on those 170 acres. At an early age, I observed Grandmother liked to be ready when company came knocking at her door. Every hair had to be in its place, and a fresh apron put on prior to the arrival of the company. Often company came unexpected, and she always met them with her jolly personality. She knew everyone in the neighborhood for miles around, as was the custom in this area of the state. Often she would yell, "Come in," while she was in the pantry checking to see that her hairnet was neatly in place. As a little boy, I began playing tricks on Grandma. I knew she would yell "come in" before she came to the door. I knocked, and after I heard her exclamation, I would run away and hide within hearing distance of her door. When she came to the door and discovered no one was there, she soon realized I was up to my tricks. And so it was that I continued this so often that many times she would yell something crazy or something to scare me away from the door. One evening at dusk, as I was at the barn, there came a knock at Grandma's door, and she was washing her evening's dishes in the pantry. She walked out into the kitchen, just far enough to yell, "The skunk will get you!" She figured that would make me run, as she had told me about persons being sprayed by a skunk and having a terrible time getting rid of the odor. Not long afterwards, she walked over to the kitchen window and observed a car pulling out of our lane. She knew immediately that someone other than me had come to her door and heard her exclamation about the skunk. She felt embarrassed as she thought about what the person might have thought, and she never found out who had come calling that evening. She told the story many times afterward and usually laughed as she told it. This Grandma had a special place in our hearts and taught us many things as we grew up. She instilled in us the importance of respecting older people. We soon learned to feel at home with older people, and oftentimes more easily than with persons of our own ages. Our grandmother died in 1964, after her 86th birthday. We missed her greatly when she left us, and somehow as the years passed, the memories of her, our childhood, and those good old days became even more precious to us.
Whenever she talked about Sam Brewster, Grandma's eyes would light up. She remembered when she was the envy of all the girls in the county. But whatever became of Grandpa Sam was anyone's guess. Would the story have a happy ending? We'll see as Helen Reed Moffitt remembers Grandma Brewster.
Along in September, when my school dress was still starch new, Grandma Brewster came to dry apples. There would come a week of misty gray mornings, then a wind quickening from the north, and the Jonathan apples would begin to fall. Mama would come in with her apron gathered into a bag full of windfalls and say to Papa, "Joe, the Jonathans are ripe. You better drive over and get your mother." There were other apples in the big orchard, but Grandma Brewster always dried Jonathans because she said they're sweet but tartish. I can see her now against a backdrop of yellowing apple trees, her brown, thin face, back knot of gray hair, blue denim skirt, and gingham waist. The sun was in my eyes. I was pensive and pale, and it was a tired, blue-like September day, the day I saw Grandma Brewster cry. I don't know why Grandma's visit stood out from others, unless it was because she moved in so completely. When Papa drove her to the front gate, the surrey always looked like a gypsy wagon piled with plunder, but once installed in the front bedroom, Grandma wasted no time. With old stockings pulled over her arms and a sunbonnet riding her gray knot of hair, she went to the orchard. Our old orchard is a childhood memory, sharp with the cidery sweetness of bruised apples. When we were all tired from picking Jonathans, she, Anne, and I would sit on the short, pale grass in the wide shade. A big blue wasp would dart up from a burst apple, and the mellow air would be one deep tang of cider. Then Grandma, in an impressive voice, would talk to us about her beaux. Mr. Simpson was an honorable gentleman. He never made any advances, though he'd begged me to marry him. Then, Mr. Brown was a devil, always squeezing my hand. More than once she'd had to put him in his place. We looked at her, Anne and I, with round eyes. Maybe her face, in its deep bonnet, did look a little like Mama's turkey hens, but we loved romance, and no other woman we knew talked like that. Grandma talked about Sam Brewster and her girlhood. He had the fastest team and the smartest buggy hereabouts. Sunday evenings we'd take a drive, and sometimes on a moonlight night we'd take a walk in the woods. It was only on these visits that Grandpa Brewster was ever mentioned at our house. He was one of the secrets, like Mama's doctor book, but in Grandma's talk he was a gay young blade who broke the other girls' hearts and took Grandma to dances at the schoolhouse near Windy Brook. I remember the fall when Papa was drawn on the jury. It was a long drive up to the county seat, so Papa went up on the Sunday evening before and stayed a week. Usually Mama and Anne and I, when left alone, were a little afraid, but with Grandma Brewster there, we felt brave and adventurous. "Let a tramp break in here," she'd say with her cheerful cackle. "I'll see he breaks out again," and we knew she meant it. That evening, when Papa drove away, thunder was muttering in the west. It was cozy in the big kitchen with Mama telling Grandma the late news of the prairie. Old Man Bean had died. At Jess Hanson's, down the road, there was a new hired man. It must have been well along in the night when a crack of thunder above the roof woke Anne and me. Mama was up. Grandma was at the window. Mama said, "Can you see the barn?" "Maybe the big maple," Grandma said, and then pointing, "No, Jenny, look there." Fire had burst into the sky at Jess Hanson's. We all ran through the rain. His barn was burning. Other neighbors were already there, trying to help save Jess's stock, and his thinnish hired man had just led a blindfolded horse out of the burning barn and had collapsed, gasping on the wet ground. Grandma Brewster, in her long rain cape, pushed into the little group around the man. Anne and I, following behind her, saw her stop and stand staring. Her thin face turned pale in the orange glow of the fire. Then Grandma pitched right in. She dropped down and took the choking man's head in her lap. She rubbed his head and chafed his hands. When he sputtered and coughed and sat up, she called for men to help him into the house, and she marched along to make hot tea for him to drink and tell Jess's wife what to do. The next morning, Grandma went with us to the orchard to pick up the new crop of windfalls. When we tried to talk, she cut us off sharply. When she straightened to rest her back, she stood looking beyond us, a kind of granite hardness in her steely eyes and brown weathered face. We had been drawn into that dour silence when the gaunt, gray-haired man whom Grandma had doctored the night before came up across Hanson's plowed land and stood at the orchard fence. He stood there a minute, shuffling and undecided. Then he called in a strained, low voice, "Tilly?" Grandma straightened and wiped her face on her apron. She stood a minute, her knuckly hands twisting together. Then she walked to the fence. "Go away! You'd better go away like you done once before, and stay. Don't come back." "Last night you doctored me. I thought maybe you meant you'd let bygones be bygones." "Bygones?" said Grandma. She was twisting her apron around and around her nervous, shaking fingers. "You went and left me and Joe when he was little. Now go away," Grandma said, tears in her eyes. The man shuffled the leaves and turned. As he went down the dusty road, Grandma Brewster laid her brown, rugged arms on the top fence rail. Her still eyes followed the man going down the hill. Then she flung out her arms. Down her flat cheeks plowed terrible tears that frightened Anne and me. "Oh, Sam, come back!" They stood together, laughing and crying, holding tight to each other's hands across the fence. "Oh, Sam," sobbed Grandma Brewster. It seemed all she could say. Anne and I stood gaping at this stooped, grayish man, and the dark, dashing picture of young Sam Brewster faded disappointingly out. There was a light in Grandma's eyes that Anne and I had never seen. "We could homestead at the old place," the man was saying. "I've got a little saved." Grandma Brewster smiled through her tears. Anne and I wondered if Grandma Brewster would be in our orchard with her apron full of windfalls the next autumn.
Well, that's all the time we have for these memories of grandmas and grandpas and the lessons we learned in those happy days of yesteryear. This is Ken Tate, editor of Good Old Days magazine, reminding you to always remember the best, and God bless.